My son handed me a glass of water at Christmas dinner. I almost didn't drink it, but I did. An hour later, I was in his kitchen with my heart pounding, staring at something that made me dial 911 with shaking hands. What I found wasn't just a family secret. It was a $2 million murder plot, and I was the target. The truth revealed itself in the quietest of moments. While my grandchildren laughed around the Christmas tree and Claire, my daughter-in-law, kept everyone's glasses filled with expensive wine. I slipped into the kitchen for a breath of air. That's when I saw the envelope. It wasn't hidden well, just half-tucked under a drawer, like someone had shoved it there in a hurry. Curiosity got the better of me. I pulled it out, expecting recipes, bills, maybe even some old holiday cards, but the first words on the folded paper made my blood turn to ice. Payment? $2,000 upon completion. Target Thomas. My name, my death. My son's signature at the bottom. At that exact second, the laughter from the dining room hit me like a cruel echo. My family, my blood, and here was proof that someone at that table wanted me gone. I gripped the counter so hard my knuckles went white. My legs felt like they couldn't hold me, and yet I forced myself to breathe, to think, to stay calm. Because one thing was suddenly clear: if I showed even the slightest crack in my composure, they'd know. And I couldn't let them know I had seen it, not yet. So, with trembling fingers, I reached for my phone and began to dial 911. The operator's voice echoed faintly in my ear. 911, what's your emergency? But the words stuck in my throat. My chest tightened, my mouth bone dry. What could I possibly say? That I was standing in my own son's kitchen, clutching papers that spelled out my death like some kind of business deal? That the boy I once taught to ride a bike, the same boy I sat beside at his first baseball game, had written my name into a murder-for-profit scheme? Saying it aloud would make it undeniable. And worse, what if he heard me? I swallowed hard, my voice barely a whisper. There's something wrong. I need help. Please send someone to... Then footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, coming closer. My blood turned to ice. I shoved the contract back into the drawer, slammed it shut with my hip, and slid the phone into my pocket just as the kitchen door creaked open. David stepped in. His smile was wide, too wide. In his hand was a carving knife slick with juices from the turkey. His shirt sleeves were rolled up neatly. No stains, no sweat. He looked calm, too calm. Dad, he said casually, his voice smooth. You disappeared. Everything okay? The blade gleamed under the chandelier light. For half a second I couldn't speak. His smile, his tone, on the surface it was normal, but underneath it felt like a mask. I forced a weak laugh. Just needed some air. Long day, you know. David's eyes narrowed, studying me in silence. The knife shifted in his grip, not in a threatening way. No, worse than that. In a way that felt comfortable. He chuckled suddenly, a laugh too quick, too practiced. Getting old, huh? Can't keep up with the kids anymore. Then he stepped forward, clapping me on the shoulder. His hand lingered, pressing just enough to make me feel trapped, like he was testing me. My breath hitched, but I kept my smile fixed. After a long pause, he pulled back, spun the knife in his fingers with a casual flick, and strolled out of the kitchen. The door swung behind him with a soft click. Only then did I exhale. My knees trembled beneath me. That wasn't small talk. That wasn't concern. That was a test. He was watching me, measuring if I suspected anything. I leaned against the counter, gripping it until my knuckles turned white. I wanted to run. Call the police back, scream, get out. But if I bolted, it was over. He'd know I had seen the papers. And if what I had read was true, if this plan had already been set in motion, then there was no telling how far they'd go to silence me. I forced myself back into the dining room. The chandelier light poured over the table, golden and warm. The turkey sat at the center like a trophy, surrounded by mashed potatoes, gravy, stuffing, and sparkling wine. The family laughed and chatted, the sound so normal it almost made me doubt myself. Almost. Because when I sat down and met Claire's eyes, David's wife, I froze. Her smile was perfect. Too perfect, polished, rehearsed. But her eyes, sharp, assessing, locked onto me like a hawk circling prey. That was when the truth sank in like a stone in my gut. It wasn't just David. Claire knew. She was part of it, maybe even the mastermind. And just like that, I realized I wasn't just surrounded by family. I was surrounded by conspirators. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and tell where are you watching from. The clinking of silverware rang in my ears like gunshots. The laughter felt hollow. Every word, every smile, it was a mask hiding teeth. and I knew one thing for certain. If I wanted to survive this night, I couldn't just sit at the table. I had to play their game. The dining room looked almost too beautiful, like something out of a holiday postcard. The chandelier glowed warmly above us. Silverware gleamed against porcelain plates, and the turkey, perfectly browned, sat like the king of the table. But all I could see were the knives, the long carving blade resting beside David, the steak knives lined neatly near every plate, and the icy precision in Claire's gaze whenever her eyes flicked toward me. I forced a smile, my fork trembling slightly in my hand. No one else seemed to notice. The conversation swirled around me. Stories, laughter, wine being poured, but to me, every sound was muffled, distant, like I was underwater. Claire leaned forward slightly, resting her chin on her hand, her wedding band catching the light. "So, Thomas," she said sweetly, her voice smooth as velvet, "how's retirement treating you? Must get lonely in that big house of yours." The question was innocent on the surface, but her tone was too deliberate, too pointed. It wasn't curiosity, it was testing me, measuring whether I would slip. I chuckled, forcing the sound up from my chest. "Oh, you know me. Books keep me company. Some days I think they talk more sense than people do." A ripple of polite laughter followed. Claire's eyes, however, did not soften. They sharpened. David raised his glass, grinning wide. "To family, the people you can always count on," the others echoed, lifting their glasses. But when his eyes locked with mine, the grin didn't look like joy. It looked like possession, a silent warning. "You're already in checkmate, old man." I sipped the wine, my stomach twisting. Every instinct screamed not to drink, but refusing would draw suspicion. The liquid burned as it slid down my throat. I set the glass down carefully, watching Claire's faint smile. That was when I saw it. A glance between her and David, small, quick, but sharp as a dagger. And in that glance, I realized they weren't just playing husband and wife tonight. They were partners. Partners in something that would end with me buried. My pulse thundered in my ears. I couldn't panic. Panic was death. So I did what I had done my whole life when backed into a corner. I played the professor, the calm, harmless old man who never noticed more than what was on the page. "Claire," I said warmly, tilting my head, "this stuffing is remarkable. Did you make it?" She blinked, caught off guard, then smiled. "Of course. Family recipe." I nodded approvingly, pretending to savor another bite. Subtle spices. Nutmeg, maybe? You've got a good hand in the kitchen. Reminds me of my late wife." Her smile faltered. "Just slightly, but enough." I pressed gently, keeping my voice calm and conversational. "You know, she taught me French back when we were courting." Beautiful language. Hard to forget once you've learned. The silence was sharp. For half a second, Claire's eyes flickered with something. Fear. Calculation, maybe both. David laughed suddenly, too loudly, clapping the table. "Dad, come on you, French? Don't tell me you're trying to impress my wife." The others laughed. Claire forced a smile. But I saw it. The smallest shift in her jaw, the tightening of her grip on the wine glass. She knew I had said it for her benefit. A warning hidden under a smile, and she hated that I had noticed. I leaned back in my chair, my heart racing beneath my calm exterior. I had sent my first message without saying it outright. I'm not as blind as you think I am. But this was just the opening move. If I wanted to make it out alive, I needed to keep them thinking they were winning. I needed them to believe the mask of the harmless, oblivious old man. Because somewhere in this house, in this meal, in this very night, they had planned the moment I would die. And if I wanted to beat them, I had to see it coming first. The laughter from the dining room rose and fell like an ocean swell, warm and musical on the surface. But in my ears it sounded like static, like the hiss of something hidden behind walls. I stood with my hand on the kitchen door, feeling the cool brass knob under my fingers, as if it were a pulse I could read. Inside, my mind was a map of every detail I'd observed all night. David's forced cheerfulness, Claire's brittle smile, the way she'd whispered to him when she thought no one was looking, the glass of wine he'd poured me, his insistence on the toast. Every gesture had felt just slightly off, like a painting hung crooked by half an inch. The kitchen lights buzzed softly, a pale hum that made the shadows stretch long and thin. The counters gleamed like mirrors. Pans hung in a neat row, polished and heavy, the handles pointing at precise angles. The smell of rosemary and roast turkey clung to the air, mingling with the faint sweetness of something else. Dessert, probably. The rich smell of chocolate drifting in from the other room. It should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like the moment before a storm breaks, when the sky goes green and birds fall silent. I placed the empty wine bottle on the counter with exaggerated normalcy, letting it roll an inch before steadying it. My hands moved automatically. Muscle memory from a lifetime of small domestic gestures, checking cupboards, moving things aside, opening a drawer just to peer in, while my ears strained to pick up sounds from beyond the door. Then I heard it. A voice, low but sharp, slicing through the muted clatter of dishes. He's drinking it. Just stop worrying, David, my son. I froze. My spine went rigid, my pulse a drumbeat at the base of my skull. Claire's voice came next, higher, nervous. He's not stupid. I saw the way he looked at me. A slow, cold wave moved through me, from scalp to toes. I edged closer to the door, careful to keep my shoes silent against the tile. Through the narrow crack between the hinges, a slice of hallway glowed with soft yellow light. Their shapes shifted across it, shadows moving like the hands of a clock. David leaned in close to her. I could see only his profile, but his mouth was a hard line, his hand gripping her arm just above the elbow. Doesn't matter if he suspects. By dessert, he'll be gone. Do you understand? It has to be tonight. We can't afford another delay. Claire's eyes darted toward the kitchen, wide and wet. And what if he left something behind? A note, or... David's expression hardened. He didn't. He's old, Claire. He's tired. We'll pour him one last drink, make it look like his heart gave out. No one will question it. For a second, the words didn't land. They floated in the air between us like snowflakes before they melt on skin. Then they hit all at once, heavy as lead. My son, my only child, plotting to kill me. My throat burned. My stomach twisted violently, as if my body were trying to expel something it already knew was inside it.
The wine.
The toast. The glass I'd raised to his future and swallowed in one sip. I steadied myself against the counter. My knuckles went white on the edge of the granite. In my head, a reel spun of every moment of the last hour, the too eager refills, the way he'd insisted I drink, the flicker of something dark behind his smile. I was poisoned. The room tilted slightly, or maybe it was just my vision narrowing. My heartbeat roared in my ears. I fought to draw a slow, silent breath, then another, forcing myself back from the edge of panic. Panic was the enemy. Panic would make them win before the game had even begun. I glanced around the kitchen. Every detail was suddenly a potential clue, a potential weapon, a potential way out. The marble countertop gleamed under the recessed lights. The sink shone like a silver basin. A small ceramic bowl sat by the stove filled with rock salt. A cutting board bore the faint grooves of knives. Everything in its place, yet the room felt alien now, like a stage built for a play I hadn't auditioned for. David's footsteps creaked toward the kitchen. I snatched up a fresh bottle of wine, twisting it casually by the neck, plastering a smile on my face just as the door swung open. "There you are," he said. His grin was wide, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Need help?" I held up the bottle. "Found it. Just had to dig a little." My voice came out light, steady, like we were two men enjoying a holiday dinner instead of actors in a death scene. He studied me for a heartbeat too long, then stepped aside, letting me pass. The dining room glowed under the chandelier, the crystal prisms scattering light across the walls like shards. The table was a picture from a magazine, white linens, silver cutlery, crystal glasses, a mountain of pine boughs, and glittering ornaments in the center, so tall you could barely see the person across from you. It would have fed a small army. A perfectly brown turkey glistened under the light, surrounded by bowls of roasted vegetables, cranberry sauce, and steaming rolls. Everything perfect. Everything poisoned. Dessert had already been laid out. A rich chocolate cake sat in the center, its glossy surface reflecting the chandelier's glow. Beside each slice sat a glass of red wine poured to the same level, the deep burgundy liquid trembling slightly as the table shifted. My slice, my glass, my death. Claire's eyes flicked to me as I took my seat. Her smile was delicate, practiced, like porcelain, but her fingers tapped against the stem of her glass, a nervous rhythm she couldn't quite suppress. Her knuckles were pale. I stared at the cake, at the glass, my mind racing. I couldn't refuse without raising suspicion. I couldn't escape without alerting them, so I would do the only thing left. I would play along. As the rich smell of chocolate filled the air, I quietly made a decision. Tonight, in their perfect dining room, with their perfect plot, I would let them believe I was falling into their trap. But the truth? I was building one of my own. I shifted in my chair, smoothing my napkin over my lap. My movements were slow, deliberate. Every nerve in my body screamed at me to run, to fight, to vomit up the poison. But outwardly I was calm, a father enjoying his son's holiday dinner. David raised his glass. "To family," he said. I raised mine too, my hand steady as stone. "To family." The rim of the glass touched my lips. I tilted it just enough for the wine to wet them, but not enough to drink. Then I set it down. My heart thudded like a drum. Claire lifted her fork, cutting into the cake. The knife's silver edge glinted under the light. David watched me, his eyes dark, searching. I smiled, a small, quiet smile that I knew from years of boardrooms and negotiations could mean anything. It could mean surrender. It could mean victory. Inside my head, gears turned. The kitchen, the phone in my pocket, the emergency number already half dialed. The one detail they'd forgotten. I had stepped away from the table. I had been in the kitchen alone. And in that brief, quiet moment, while they whispered about my death, I had left my fingerprints on more than just a wine bottle. I had touched the phone. I had sent the message. "Help! Come now!" Address attached. Poison. The words were already on their way, hidden in plain sight. I reached for my fork, cutting into the cake, keeping my movement steady, unhurried. Each bite I pretended to take was a piece of the performance. Each smile was a mask I wore a little tighter. They thought they were watching me die. They had no idea they were watching me plan. And as the clock ticked, softly on the mantel and the candles guttered, in their holders, a low, distant sound began to rise in my ears, the sound of sirens, faint but growing, like wolves moving closer through snow. I chewed slowly, my eyes meeting David's across the table. "Delicious," I said softly. And somewhere outside, tires crunched on snow. The trap had begun to close. The sound of sirens grew louder, weaving through the muffled hum of the city night beyond the frosted windows. It started faint, like a thread tugging at the edge of the evening, then wound itself tighter and tighter until it pressed against the walls of the house. David's fork paused midway to his mouth. Claire's hand froze on her wineglass, the crimson liquid trembling as it reflected the chandelier's fractured light. My pulse beat steady now, calm in a way I hadn't expected, because I knew they didn't. David glanced at Claire, then back at me, his jaw tightening. "Strange," he said lightly, forcing a smile. "Hope there's not an accident nearby." I dabbed my lips with the napkin, slow and deliberate. "Could be. This weather makes people reckless." The words hung between us. Neither of them missed the double meaning. The sirens stopped abruptly. The sudden silence was heavier than sound, pressing down on the room like a held breath. Then came the crunch of tires over snow, doors slamming, voices murmuring, sharp, professional. Claire's fingers slipped on her glass, leaving a faint streak of condensation on the stem. "David," she whispered, her voice thin. "Relax," he hissed back, too low for most to hear. But not me, never me. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands over my lap like a man who had just finished a pleasant meal. "Expecting someone?" I asked, my tone featherlight, almost amused. Before he could respond, 3 firm knocks rattled the front door. Not polite, not hesitant, knocks of authority. David's smile wavered. He stood quickly, too quickly, nearly toppling his chair. "Stay here," he muttered, striding out toward the hall. Claire stared after him, pale, her breath shallow. I let my gaze linger on her for a moment, then shifted it to my untouched wineglass, the red liquid gleaming darkly. I nudged it slightly across the table with one finger, just enough to make the point. Her eyes widened. In the hallway, the door creaked open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the scent of snow and asphalt. A low, firm voice. "Mr. Thomas Whitaker?" I heard the pause. Then David's reply, shaky. Yes, this is his residence." "Can I help you?" "No," the officer said flatly. "We're here to help him." Boots thudded against the hardwood. A shadow filled the doorway. Then 2 uniformed officers stepped into the dining room. Their eyes swept the scene. Half-eaten plates, untouched wine, my calm figure at the head of the table, and Claire frozen like a porcelain doll about to crack. "Mr. Whitaker?" one officer asked, his gaze locking on me. I nodded, rising slowly. "Yes, officer." "Thank you for coming." David appeared behind them, his face drawn tight. His smile had completely collapsed now, replaced by a brittle edge of panic. "There's been some mistake. My father is fine. We're just having dinner." I cut him off. My voice was calm, steady, but every word sharp as glass. "Officer, check the glasses. especially mine. Claire's hand shot out toward my glass, but one of the officers intercepted her, his hand closing over hers. "Step back, ma'am." The other officer lifted my glass carefully, sniffed it, then produced a small testing kit from his pocket. A drop of liquid, a faint color shift. His eyes flicked to me, then hardened. "Sir, you were right to call." David's face drained of blood. "Wait, you don't understand. This is a family dinner." Claire stammered. "It was just wine, just—" But their words tangled in the air, desperate, empty. I turned to the officers, my voice steady. They wanted me gone, tonight. A heart attack, quiet, convenient. I leaned slightly, my eyes never leaving David's. But convenience has a price. I leaned slightly, my eyes never leaving David's. But convenience has a price. But I was already pulling a folded paper from my pocket. My last move in the game. Paranoid, I said softly, holding the document just high enough for the officers to see. Or prepared. The paper was a notarized letter, dated 3 days ago, a legal addendum to my will, spelling out exactly who would inherit what and who would inherit nothing. I had signed it with the ink barely dry. David saw it. His eyes widened with sudden animal panic. You changed it? When? Why? Because, I said. I saw the way you looked at me when you poured the wine. Silence crashed over the room. Even the officers stilled for a moment. Watching the air drain from David's chest, I tucked the paper back into my jacket. Everything you thought was yours, gone. Everything you plotted for, vanished. And all because you couldn't hide your greed for one night. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. His struggles turned desperate, his voice rising. "You can't do this. I'm your son." I stepped closer, meeting his wild eyes. My voice dropped to a whisper only he could hear. "You stopped being my son the moment you raised a glass to my death." The officers led them both toward the door. Claire sobbed. David cursed, their voices fading as the cold air rushed in again. The house grew quiet. Silent except for the ticking of the clock and the faint crackle of the dying fire. I sat back down at the head of the table. Alone now, but alive. I picked up the fork, cut a piece of cake, and let it linger on my tongue. "Delicious," I murmured again. But sweeter still was the taste of survival, and the knowledge that the game had always been mine. The silence after the front door shut was louder than any shouting. For a long time I just sat there, fork still in hand, the clock ticking on the wall, marking each second like a heartbeat. For 72 years I had built everything brick by brick, board by board, deal by deal. Tonight proved how fragile it could all become with one poison sip. But tonight also proved something else, foresight. Patience and quiet strength will always outlast greed. I pushed my plate away, the cake half-eaten, and stood, walking slowly to the living room. The fire still burned, soft embers glowing against the stone hearth. I sank into the leather chair that had molded to my shape over the years and closed my eyes. I could still hear David's voice ringing in my ears. "You can't do this."
"I'm your son."
Son. The word felt hollow now, like an echo bouncing inside a cavern long emptied. Was he really my son? Not anymore. A son is loyalty. A son is respect. A son doesn't smile while plotting your last breath. And Claire? Claire had fooled me once. Sweet words, gentle smiles, the perfect daughter-in-law. I had even believed she loved him, at least in her way. But tonight her mask slipped. I saw the hunger in her eyes, the same hunger that had been eating David alive. Together they had built a plan. Together they thought they could bury me. But what they never understood, what they never wanted to understand, was that I had been preparing for wolves like them all my life. The truth was, the police weren't here by accident. That quiet warning from the restaurant security guard weeks earlier had set my mind spinning. That night when he whispered, "I saw him pour something into your juice," I didn't just thank him and go home. I contacted an old friend, Detective Raymond Holt, retired, but still sharp, still connected. He listened, didn't interrupt, then told me to do exactly what I'd always done best. Build. Build a case. Build a record. Build a trap. And so I had. For 3 weeks, every drink, every meal, every gathering I documented. Subtle signs, strange gestures. The sudden generosity David showed, trying to ease me into comfort. The way Claire's hand lingered over my glass too long. I wrote it down, recorded it even, when I called the police tonight. It wasn't a panicked father, it was a man handing them a file, dates, notes, evidence, enough to turn suspicion into certainty. The will? That was the final nail. David believed the future was written in his favor, that everything I had would fall into his lap. But I had rewritten it quietly, stripping him bare. Instead, the estate would go to charities, foundations, and, most importantly, the in-laws he had mocked for years. People who had stood by me, people who deserved it. I rose and walked to the window, looking out over the snow-covered lawn. Tire tracks scarred the driveway where the squad car had taken my son and his wife away. Strangely, I felt no sorrow, only clarity. Some people mistake legacy for bloodlines. They think inheritance is about sharing wealth simply because of shared DNA. But legacy is about values, about what survives you, not just who survives you. David had my name, but not my spirit. He carried my blood, but not my honor. And that's why he lost everything tonight. For the first time in years, the house felt peaceful. Not quiet from emptiness, but calm from honesty. No more false smiles across the dinner table. No more hidden hands tipping poison into glasses. Just truth. And truth, though often painful, is the cleanest kind of peace. But just as I allowed myself to sink into that peace, to let the fire lull me into rest, another knock echoed at the door. Not harsh like the police before, not timid either. 3 measured, deliberate knocks. I frowned, rising again, the floor creaking under my steps. Opening the door, I expected perhaps a neighbor, or maybe the detective returning with questions. But instead there stood the security guard from the restaurant, the man whose warning had saved my life. He held something in his hand, a small, weathered notebook. "Mr. Whitaker," he said, his voice low. "There's more you need to know. Tonight wasn't just about them. It goes deeper, much deeper." His eyes were steady, serious, and in that moment I realized the story wasn't over. The trap I had set may have caught David and Claire, but there were still shadows moving behind the curtain. Shadows I had only just begun to see. The police station was colder than I expected. Not in temperature, but in spirit. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, casting a sterile glow over the metal table I sat at. My hands, still trembling from the night's events, were wrapped around a paper cup of lukewarm coffee. Across from me, Detective Harris studied me with the patience of a man who had heard every kind of lie, every kind of truth, and knew how to weigh one against the other. "Mr. Thomas," he said finally, his voice low and even, "start from the beginning, everything, don't leave anything out." And so I did. I told him about Christmas dinner, about the glass of water my son David had handed me, about the faint bitterness on my tongue that I had dismissed in the moment. I told him about slipping away into the kitchen, the discovery of the bottles hidden beneath the sink, unmarked, but clearly dangerous. I described the way my hands shook when I realized the truth, that my own son had laced my drink, that the boy I had raised, the child I had carried on my shoulders, the man I had taught to ride a bike and drive a car, was now plotting my death. Detective Harris didn't interrupt. He just sat there, his pen scratching slowly across the page as I recounted the horror. When I reached the part about dialing 911, about the moment the truth crystallized in my mind, I felt my throat tighten. My voice cracked, but I forced myself to continue. "It wasn't just about me," I whispered. "It was about $2 million. Life insurance, property, assets, my son and his wife. They wanted everything, and I was in the way." The detective set down his pen, folded his hands, and leaned forward. "And you're certain the intent was murder?" "Yes," I said, the word heavy on my tongue. "There's no doubt in my mind." He smiled at me while I drank it. He watched me, waiting. For a moment the room was silent except for the faint hum of the lights above. Then Harris exhaled slowly, as if releasing a burden he hadn't realized he'd been holding. "All right, we'll take it from here." But that was only the beginning. The next weeks unfolded like a nightmare stretched thin over reality. David and his wife, Claire, were arrested within 48 hours. The search of their home had uncovered not just the poison, but notes, emails, even financial documents outlining exactly what they stood to gain from my death. It wasn't sloppy, not entirely, but greed has a way of leaving fingerprints. They had researched dosages, side effects, even rehearsed stories for how they would explain my sudden heart failure. The betrayal cut deeper with every revelation. The next weeks unfolded like a nightmare stretched thin over reality. David and his wife, Claire, were arrested within 48 hours. The search of their home had uncovered not just the poison, but notes, emails, even financial documents outlining exactly what they stood to gain from my death. It wasn't sloppy, not entirely, but greed has a way of leaving fingerprints. They had researched dosages, side effects, even rehearsed stories for how they would explain my sudden heart failure. The betrayal cut deeper with every revelation. I couldn't stop replaying it in my mind. The little gestures, the small signs I had ignored. How Claire always pushed for me to sign papers quickly without reading. How David had grown distant, his phone always buzzing with hushed conversations. How at dinners there was always a glance between them when money came up. They hadn't just stumbled into this plan. They had been building it for years. And I had been blind. The trial was scheduled within months, but to me, time felt warped. Each day was an endless stretch of questions, reporters and restless nights where sleep eluded me. The world wanted the story, the Christmas poisoning plot, they called it. Newspapers and online headlines plastered my face. My son's mugshot, Claire's cold eyes. But for me it wasn't a story. It was my life unraveling. I sat through every court session, each one a wound reopening. I watched as the prosecution laid out the evidence, the bottles, the searches, the financial motive. I listened as the defense tried to spin it all as a misunderstanding, a case of paranoia and coincidence. And worst of all, I watched my son stand there, expressionless, as though I were nothing more than a stranger pointing a finger. Sometimes he looked at me, but there was no remorse in his eyes, only calculation, and that hurt more than any poison could. One night, unable to sleep, I walked through my empty house. Every room felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by memories. The kitchen where David used to sit on the counter as a boy, swinging his legs while I made pancakes. The living room where we built forts out of couch cushions. The hallway where he had once run to me after scraping his knee, tears streaming down his little face. How had we come to this? How had love turned to greed, innocence to malice? I thought of his mother, my late wife, and wondered what she would have said if she had lived to see this. Would she have blamed me? Would she have seen the signs I missed? Would she have wept? Or would she have hardened? The way I now felt myself hardening, I would never know. The verdict came on a gray afternoon. The jury filed back into the courtroom, their faces unreadable. I sat in the front row, my hands clenched so tightly together that my knuckles ached. David and Claire sat at the defense table, whispering to each other, though neither smiled. Guilty, the foreman said, on all counts. Attempted murder, conspiracy, fraud. The words rang through the courtroom like church bells, heavy and final. Claire's face crumpled, her mask breaking for the first time. She sobbed, shoulders shaking violently. David just sat there, his jaw clenched, his eyes staring forward, unblinking. Not once did he look at me. When the judge read the sentence, 25 years each, my chest tightened. But not with relief, with grief, with the unbearable weight of finality. I had lost my son long before the gavel struck wood. But now it was written in stone. After the trial, people told me I should feel vindicated. That justice had been served. That I had survived something most couldn't imagine. And that I should hold my head high. But I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt hollow. The holidays came and went. Friends invited me to dinners. Neighbors dropped by with pies and casseroles. But I couldn't shake the silence in my house. I couldn't escape the ghost of betrayal that lingered in every corner. One evening, months later, I found myself back in the kitchen. The same kitchen where I had discovered the poison. I stood there, staring at the spot under the sink where the bottles had been hidden. I thought of how close I had come to dying, how easily the story could have ended differently, and for the first time in a long time I allowed myself to cry. Not for me, not for survival, but for the boy I had raised, the boy who had once held my hand, the boy who had become my would-be killer. But here's the thing about grief, it doesn't have to be the end. Over time I began to rebuild, not because I wanted to, but because life demanded it. I volunteered at a local community center, mentoring young men who had no fathers. I poured my pain into teaching them, guiding them, hoping that maybe, just maybe, I could keep them from becoming another David. I started to write too, journals at first, then essays. Stories of betrayal, survival, and the thin line between love and destruction. It helped. It gave shape to the chaos. And in that process, I discovered something unexpected. Strength. Not the loud, aggressive kind, but the quiet kind. The kind that comes from standing back up when the world has knocked you down. The kind that comes from choosing not to be consumed by bitterness, even when bitterness is the easiest path. Years later, I returned to the cemetery where my wife was buried. I brought fresh flowers, knelt by her grave, and spoke softly. I failed him, I admitted. I couldn't save him. But I survived. and I'm trying to honor what we built, even if it looks nothing like what we imagined. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of earth and grass. For the first time in years, I felt a sliver of peace, because betrayal had nearly killed me, but it hadn't. And though I had lost a son, I had found something else in the ashes, my own resilience. And that, I realized, was worth more than any fortune.